welcome to the latest Open World Chat. I'm John Odom, and my usual co-host Leanne Allen is on vacation. So my co-host this week is Maryscott O'Connor, who is known to many in the political blogging universe. But I want to take just a moment before we get into this installment because it went quite differently than our shows generally go. I've been looking for someone to have a conversation breaking down Star Trek's Prime Directive of non-interference in other cultures, and I'm sure everyone who's tuning into this knows all about the Prime Directive. But I wanted to see if there was a more comprehensive ethic of foreign intervention to be pieced together. After looking for an ethicist, it occurred to me to approach Peter Galbraith, who, like myself, lives in Vermont, which makes him a neighbor of sorts. Peter is an author, scholar, and diplomat with an extraordinary resume. An ambassador to Croatia, who helped to negotiate an end to the war there. He discovered that Saddam Hussein was gassing his own people, and he became one of the strongest advocates for the Kurdish people in post-war Iraq. He was also the United Nations Deputy Special Representative for Afghanistan, and he and the UN parted ways when he took a hard line on the electoral fraud in the nation's 2009 presidential election. This is someone who has done a lot of good work. And this isn't just any point in history we're in. Afghanistan is very much front and center in the news as I speak these words, as the U.S. has ended its presence in the country and the Taliban instantly returned to power. And while the full effects on the Afghani people are far from coming into clear focus, it's clearly going to be very bad for very many innocent people. So, don't expect the usual geek conversation this week as our genre bubble gave way to what is a very dark chapter playing out before our eyes, and it commanded our full attention. So, the first thing I asked Peter is what he was currently working on. And just briefly, before I get to his answer, I need to apologize for the terrible, terrible sound this episode. It was just a perfect storm of unfortunate events. But here's Peter.
Well, for the last month or so, it's been Afghanistan all the time. I served there in 2009. I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations to Afghanistan. In Washington, there's a rule that the longer the title, the less important the job. But the UN being a good bureaucracy, it made me the number 2 in the UN mission. Although since the number 1, by his own account, couldn't manage a 2-car motorcade and was mostly absent, I effectively was running. It was a large mission of about, maybe 1,000 international staff and 6,000 or 7,000 Afghans.
Now, this was Eide? Is that was his last name? Eide?
Yeah.
Your former friend?
A Norwegian diplomat who at one time was a friend. But the main issues that arose during my time were relations with Pakistan, which I was handling, and the UN support for the Afghan presidential elections, which the UN was paying for, and which were really critical to the success of the Western mission. The Western mission, the NATO mission, was to run a counterinsurgency. And in order to have effective counterinsurgency, you need to have a partner. And already the partner, the government of Hamid Karzai, was corrupt and ineffective. So if you have a fraudulent election, you run the risk that he will be considered illegitimate. And that's effectively what happened. So in any event, the last month has been involved a lot of discussion looking back at that period, and also the broader experience of Afghanistan. It's a country I followed for the U.S. government, for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee from 1979 until 1993. I actually visited it in 1989 for the first time. So, and then inevitably I was trying to help people get out as this looked like Kabul was going to fall, and of course did fall. And that entailed UN staff trying to get them on the list of people who could be evacuated without any success, as well as specific individuals who got in touch. And I have to say, also without success. So that's what I've been doing for the last month. More broadly, in recent years, I've been very much involved, as you noted in the introduction, in Kurdistan, and particularly in northeast Syria, the Kurdish-controlled part of Syria. I've been helping them build capacity as negotiators, because I think in the end, they're going to have to negotiate some bargain with the Syrian government, whether you like it or not. And it's very hard to like it, but it did win the war. And so, that there has to be some modus vivendi between the two sides, but also for a variety of reasons, on humanitarian activities. So I've been helping or negotiating and arranging and actually signing for and physically bringing together the children of raped Yazidi women. These were girls. I say girls because they were all teenagers or even younger who were kidnapped 2014 by the Islamic State, sold as sex slaves, and of course got pregnant. And then when ISIS fell in 2019, the Yazidi religious establishment, I should say the all-male Yazidi religious establishment, rejected the children and basically separated the mothers from their children, in some cases even forcibly. So the children went to an orphanage. I visited that in 2019. Initially thought there was no hope of getting them back to their mothers, and therefore to see if they could go for international adoption, which was very complicated. But then I learned from a Swedish Kurdish doctor that she had found 20 mothers with 30 children that wanted their children back, but she had been unable to get either the Kurdistan government on the Iraqi side or the Syrian Kurds to agree, or the UN to help. But it was something, because of my connections with the Kurds, I was able to do, not easily, but after prolonged negotiations, in March, I reunited 9 mothers with 12 children who were on the 9 mothers who were in Iraq. The 12 children were in Syria. And then I've now reunited every mother who wants their child. So that's been the main thing. But the other aspect of it is I was asked with Bernard Kouchner, who's my longtime friend, founder of Doctors Without Borders and foreign minister of France at one point, with a long history of the Kurds, even longer than mine. We were asked to help to deal with the problem of the 10,000 foreign ISIS fighters, women and children. And so through that, I've brought out some children and a couple of mothers. And I go back and forth doing that. So that's been, some of my activities in recent years. I've been also writing, but not as prolifically as I would like.
It sounds to me like you got a pretty emotional connection to the idea of the kidnapping of women and the sex slavery involved with these particular fighters, if you want to call them fighters, the extremists.
Yeah, I mean, these young women, the stories they told were so terrible, and they being captured. In one case, this was a young woman who was in the same school with the school building that Nadia Murad was, and like Nadia Murad's family, her family was all killed. And then, unlike Nadia Murad, she didn't escape, and then she lost her when she became pregnant, and her daughter was almost 6 when this year, and so she became pregnant, I guess, really quite quickly, and they 2019 they took her daughter away, and. When you saw them, when I brought the mothers across the Tigris, that's the border between Iraqi Kurdistan and Syria, and the children were on the Syrian side, and she sort of went into the room instantly spotted her daughter and just grabbed and hugged this girl. The girl really didn't, and was sobbing, and the girl didn't know who she was. Of course, I mean, but I've gone back and seen them a few times, and the daughter is a really sweet girl, and the last time I saw her, she gave me a bunch of hugs and had made all these drawings. The other women's stories are just, equally compelling. So it's hard not to have an emotional connection. I also think there's been a lot of focus on the so-called ISIS brides and their children. But rightly, and I certainly think the children should be, taken out of, they're kept in prison camps. Some of the mothers, the two I brought out, had clearly have rejected radicalism. One of them's living in Germany. She sends me pictures of the kids, Easter egg hunts, Christmas. She's in university. But, these were all women who chose to go to Syria to join a terrorist organization. To focus just on that and not on the victims, it just somehow seemed wrong to me.
There was you said something about the women who, I was watching you speak to a group about the women who chose to go with them, and they got to keep their kids, but the women who had been kidnapped into slavery were separated from their children. I did not quite understand that. Where was the logic in that?
There wasn't, of course. The logic was that the Syrian Kurds did not want to be accused of violating human rights, and they felt forcibly separating the children, ISIS children, from their mothers would violate the human rights of the mothers, of the ISIS mothers. Even though it means that the children are growing up in prisons, and these are large camps, but they're guarded with, very bad sanitary conditions, no education, minimal health care, and where many of the mothers remain radical. So they're raising their children to be the next generation of, suicide bombers, rapists, murderers, jihadis. Whereas the Yazidi girls who were kidnapped, when they were discovered to be Yazidis, their children were taken away. And the logic was that they had to respect the feelings of the Yazidi religious community. In some sense, it was putting in first place the human rights of the Yazidi religious community as a whole ahead of the human rights of the mothers. Because the Yazidi religion does not accept conversion, you can't marry outside the Yazidi faith. You can only be a Yazidi if you're born to be Yazidi. And beyond that, of course, these were the children born of rapes by the very people who were committing genocide against the Yazidis. But that said, it also reflects a mentality where these girls were treated as property, not as people. And so, yes, it was an impossible situation. And in the end, I have to say the Syrian Kurds recognized the difficulty of their situation, and they ended up doing the right thing. Required a certain amount of persuasion.
It sounds to me like you had a little bit of something to do with that.
Well, I
diplomacy.
Spent, hours over it, but I was helped by one thing. I began my government career in 1979 working for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And one of the members of that committee, from the time that I arrived till the time that I left to be the ambassador to Croatia, was the senator from Delaware. Whom in 1990, I had actually introduced him to the Kurdish leaders when they came after Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, and he's had a long association. So, and he's been somebody I've known, and I would consider a friend. I think he feels the same way. And so it was not so hard to be talking to them and being able to talk about a president of the United States who who genuinely humanitarian issues move him a lot. I mean, that he's empathetic, but I know the empathy that was very specific in the Kurdish cases, and I think that probably helped in terms of getting the Syrian Kurds who depend on the United States to come to the right conclusion.
Now, I want to be careful when I ask this, because I don't want to sound as though I'm diminishing some of these struggles and the horrors that these folks have been going through, and say, oh, but what about the poor, privileged American guy? But I still have to ask, this has got to take a toll. For years and years, you are waking up and you're dealing with some of the worst that humanity has to offer. Just at a personal level, how do you do that?
Well, I don't know that. I mean, I think if you have a sense that you're accomplishing something, it's not so stressful. And I think, John, a point you made in your question, I'm encountering it, but I'm not really living it.
Right.
I have a very comfortable life in a beautiful state, and safe. So, of course, it affects me emotionally, but it's not the same as the people who experience it. There were at certain times of stress, but that was when I was ambassador to Croatia, handling both the war in Croatia and the war in Bosnia, and that was sort of day in, day out, and occasionally I'd take a break and go to Austria, for example, and go skiing in places where there's 3 or 4 hour drive away, and everybody was just having a good time, and you kind of felt, don't you really understand what's happening? 120 miles from here, but otherwise, you do what you can, and I suppose that the fact that there've been some good results also makes it feel worthwhile.
I can't emphasize enough that it takes a certain kind of character to do what you do. I've been looking over your CV for a long time now, a week, and I couldn't do it. I simply could not do it. I agree completely. You say that that it helps to see that you're making progress and that you do recognize your privilege, but I watched your face when you were talking about those girls, and maybe it's Texas, what's going on in Texas right now, but I look at what you've done and the constant Sisyphean fight that you must be in, and it would kill me. It would just kill me. And to see that you go back time and time again and you keep fighting. And, I've got an unbelievable amount of admiration for you and what you've done and what you continue to do. It's extraordinary. I'm sorry. I would make a terrible journalist. I have no objectivity whatsoever. I'm just astonished by you.
Well, you're very kind, but frankly, I think objectivity is vastly overrated. I have one of my collaborators is a journalist. I won't name the person, but he's participatory, and in fact, because he was participatory, he introduced me to the German woman who wanted to send her children out. And that was the first case of the ISIS children that I brought out. Three kids, 6, 5, and a girl who was 3. And she was the stepmother to an American child whom I also brought out, and orphan. It was her. I mean, if you can have a stepdaughter, not of a consecutive parent, but of the co-wife. Right. Both the husband and the co-wife were killed, yeah. So, but this was a journalist who didn't just report, but who kind of gave me the contact and said, this woman wants to send her children out. And in fact, at the very last minute, the German government, which was really helpful, said, well, we can't ask for the mother because, we aren't bringing out adults. But if you think, she seems like a good person and we won't object if you bring her out. So I brought her out too. And she was a good person. And she had cooperated extensively with the FBI. I mean, through me, they asked questions, she gave answers. There are people who certainly, earn their freedom. And in this case, although the German government has a couple of cases against her, I think they're not going to send her in jail because they realize that would be so bad for the children.
That statement you made, objectivity is overrated, was an extraordinary statement. It got me smiling. And it does make me wonder, your relationship with objectivity must be interesting since you work as an advocate on the one hand, but then you're also a diplomat. You've negotiated treaties where it's a little harder to maybe be so much overtly an advocate, and objectivity becomes a little more your best friend there.
Well, obviously, yes, you have to have an element of objectivity. In fact, a strong element. But in my experience, and I negotiated the peace agreement that ended the Croatia War. So between rebel Serbs who were basically controlled by Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian war criminal, and the Croatians side, who had their own human rights problems. But I found actually that in a certain way I connected with both sides, but maybe particularly on a negotiating level with the Serbian side, precisely because, I think they felt that I cared, that I wasn't always objective. I mean, I wasn't, I was very harsh in criticizing them for their human rights records and for the murders. On the other hand, they also knew that I was kind of personally engaged in wishing to protect Serbian civilians, those who had fled the Croatian military offensive and who Croatia said couldn't come back. And I kept insisting as part of the agreement that they should have to come back. It wasn't actually a demand that the Serbian side made at all. It was my demand as the mediator. And I suppose that's a bit unusual because normally you'd think a mediator between two sides would want to find the common agreement. But there were certain things that I just thought had to be in the agreement. They were. And interestingly, although the Croatians did not like that was 1995, by 2001, 6 years later, they were trumpeting those human rights provisions. There'd been a change of government in Croatia. The nationalist president Tudjman had died, but also they wanted to join the European Union. And they realized that at least this agreement had European values that they cared about. I mean, not only was it instrumental, they wanted to get into the European Union, but I think they also came to actually care about those things.
So this brings to mind a question. Obviously, all three of us speaking here are, I suppose you could call us human rights interventionists, insofar as that goes. But what should the threshold be? At what point does something, I don't want to say becomes heinous enough, but you know what I mean? What's the floor? At what point do we get involved, and at what point then do we not?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And if you look at the history of American intervention since the end of the Cold War, since basically 1990, 1991, you can see in the 1990s, 3 very successful cases in terms of accomplishing your objectives. And they were the first Persian Gulf War, after Saddam invaded Kuwait, Bosnia, and Kosovo. And then you get to this century, and we have 2 utterly disastrous interventions, Afghanistan And it's impossible to overstate the failure in Afghanistan. I mean, 20 years, $2 trillion, nearly 2,500 American casualties, 20,000 Americans wounded, many very severely. Several thousand more American contractors, several thousand of our NATO allies, hundreds of billions spent on the training in Iraq, Afghan army and police. And at this stage, there's nothing to show for it. And then Iraq, which has somewhat more mixed results in Iraq, but a huge question of whether it was worth it for the United States.
Can I disagree for just a moment? There is just one little thing to show for it. 20 years of moderate freedom for women. Moderate freedom.
Okay,
they don't have it anymore, and it's being ripped from them right now. And it wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth it. None of it was worth it. And I want to know, what should we have done? How could we have done this differently? Yeah. We shouldn't have gone there, but something had to be done. We didn't do it right.
I don't want to say that there was nothing good done over the 20 years, and obviously
it simply wasn't worth it.
But what I'm saying is right now, in September of 2021, it's all gone. There's on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, there is zero to show for it. I suppose the only thing to show for it is the probability maybe that the Taliban is smart enough not to sponsor Al Qaeda again. But that's it. But the point I was going to make is that we had, in the 90s, 3 successful interventions. If I look at the Bosnia and Kosovo interventions, those took place with 0 American casualties, 0 NATO casualties. And I think in Bosnia, we spent maybe $10 billion, in Kosovo, roughly the same. Of course, we had allies who picked up 2/3 of the cost. But, compare that to Afghanistan, $2 trillion. And in both cases, all 3 cases, they were successful. We've had, I would argue, one successful intervention in the 21st century, and that is with the Syrian Kurds in fighting the Islamic State. So, if you want to know what is in common with those interventions, is that in each of those cases, we intervened on behalf of a local party, the government of Kuwait, the Bosnian government, the Kosovars, and the Syrian Kurds, to assist them to accomplish their objectives. Where we failed was when we substituted the local party's objectives and tried to remake countries the way we thought they should be, as we did in Afghanistan and as we tried to do in Iraq. I said Afghanistan was $2 trillion. All told, the Iraq war is probably twice as much, $4 trillion, and of course, twice as deadly in terms of American casualties. That to me is the key difference in the interventions. The other point, I want to come back to John's point about objectivity, because here I think you have to have objectivity. When you're a negotiator, maybe you can be a little engaged. I mean, certainly when I was talking to the Syrian Kurds about the Yazidi mothers, I could promise you I was very emotional. And just calling them out, saying, how can you say you're for women's rights? Because that's a big part of their thing, and yet not let the mothers have their children. But I always say, for anything you do in foreign policy, no matter what it is, actually, the first test is, will it work? You don't have to ask whether it's right or wrong. Right. If it won't work, don't do it. Even if it's the most right thing to do. Once you've decided that, yes, it will work, then, of course, you have to say, is it right or wrong, and is it worth it? But if it won't work, you don't need even to get to those secondary those second and third questions, which of course are extremely important. And so I think there's a great deal of objectivity to apply to that first question. Of course, is it the right thing to do? Yes. Then there's a more subjective and emotional and judgmental kind of thing. It's very hard to measure these things strictly by objective standards because it depends on your values. And that's the same with the third question. Is it worth it? But on that first question, will it work? That is objective. And the problem in Afghanistan is that it wasn't going to work. And the military, the commanding generals knew it. And yet they went ahead with a strategy that they knew couldn't work. And that is, to me, in terms of the American intervention, shameful.
Do you think behind the scenes, was anybody saying, this is dumb, we should not be here, we need to stop this? Did anybody say that? I mean, in the military.
There were people in the military, but ultimately, it's the civilians who make the decision and the president. They rely on the advice of their military commander. But, Holbrooke, for example, was certainly skeptical. And here's the fundamental failure in Afghanistan to understand what went wrong. The strategy was a counterinsurgency strategy. And if you had David Petraeus here on this show, he was an architect of counterinsurgency strategy. He would say, in order for a counterinsurgency strategy to work, you need to have a local partner. And why do you need a local partner? Because the strategy has three components, and the military likes very short phrases. Clear. Your NATO troops can come in and clear the enemy, the insurgents, the Taliban out of an area. But then you need to hold it. And your NATO forces can't be in Afghanistan forever holding the territory. So you've got to have a local military, a local police, and a local government who can come in and hold it. And then you want to build. That means you want to get you want the local government to provide services. You want economic development so that people see that they're safe, that their lives are getting better. And then the idea is that you'll win the population over. That the least committed insurgents will come on your side. The medium committed will sort of lay down. And then the population will basically rat out the remaining extremists, and you can go arrest them. That's the idea behind counterinsurgency.
But our partners didn't.
But if you don't have a partner, then it doesn't work. So
right.
You had an Afghan military that was, whose leadership was corrupt. They were stealing salaries. They had ghost soldiers. They weren't willing to fight. You had the local government that came in was corrupt. It was often in league with the Taliban. Think the connection in Italy, in the last century between Sicily, between the mafia and the local police. I mean, they weren't enemies. They were in league with each other. And that was what was happening there. And so as rural Afghans experienced things, they experienced the Afghan government as corruption. USAID would build roads, and the police, to enable farmers to stop being subsistence farmers and sell their products, and the police would set up roadblocks and take so much that the farmers would be robbed of everything, so they remained subsistence farmers. Or the police would go into an area, they would kidnap somebody's boy for sexual purposes. So the way many rural Afghans experienced the government was as abusive.
So isn't there a tension there between, you talk about the practical, but then in the political? Because, when something goes awry, there's always so much pressure on the political end of things to get in there and do something.
I'm not sure it works out that way. First, let me come in on the military commanders again. I mean, basically, everything that I had to say about the way in which the Afghan government worked, they understood. Nonetheless, they kept using these metrics to show progress. So they would say, we've trained so many Afghan army people, so many Afghan police, without regard to the fact that, as they knew, the police, you could train a policeman, but you couldn't train him to make him honest. That they knew that the Afghan forces were ineffective. I was on a program with a guy who had been in the military, and he was describing. He was a West Pointer and a colonel, I think, and his job was to be grading these Afghan units, and the scale was 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 the lowest, 4 the highest, and he was grading them at 1 and 2, and then as it went up the chain of command, they would be raised to 3s and 4s to basically report progress. And here's the great flaw: when you have a military strategy, it should be based on the facts. But what we have here was trying to fit the facts to the strategy that was already determined. Now, what I was going to say is I don't agree with your premise that we everybody just wanted to rush in to Afghanistan, or it wants to rush in these situations. Actually, just to go back to the interventions in the 90s, at least Bosnia and Kosovo, there's great reluctance to go in. In fact, many of us who advocated for intervention, I certainly did from my perch in Zagreb, felt that it took us much too long to step in and end the war. And if we had stepped in earlier, we would have saved maybe 100,000 lives.
I remember.
So it was a long time coming in Kosovo too. So, you can say things are too late. You had the attacks on 9/11. They came out of Afghanistan. The Taliban were protecting al-Qaeda. I think you had to do something. But what we did in 2001 was to enter with a very light force, special forces operating with the Northern Alliance, the group of Afghans, because the Taliban didn't control the entire country. They controlled about 85%. So 15% it didn't control, the Northern Alliance. We used air power. And we helped the Northern Alliance, which is primarily Tajik and Hazara, two of Afghan's ethnic communities, accomplish their objectives, which were to oust the Taliban and to take Kabul. And if we'd stopped there, I think the thing might have worked. We could have left it to the Northern Alliance then to negotiate with the Pashtuns and to have some kind of arrangement. But instead, having done that at very low cost, we then engaged in this exercise in nation building. We convened a conference in Bonn, and we created a constitution for Afghanistan, which was highly centralized, all power concentrated in Kabul. The Kabul decided who would hire and fire a local school superintendent, and within Kabul, it all be concentrated with the president. So, and this was for a country that's one of the most ethnically and geographically diverse in the world. So it obviously didn't work. And even a presidential system, when you have a multi-ethnic country, well, the president's only going to be from one ethnic group. And in this case, There was always Pashtuns. Whereas if you have a parliamentary system, you can apportion this among the different groups. And in that sense, Iraq is more successful than Afghanistan. Again, the key to success of the strategy we had was to have a partner. So you have the government is corrupt, ineffective. And then in 2009, Karzai steals the election. How does he steal it? He appoints the Independent Election Commission. So they're all appointed by him. They're the people running the election. They're the people stealing the election for him. And so there was a crisis of legitimacy, but not just that. When you steal an election, who's stealing the election for you? Corrupt power brokers. You're beholden to them. So even if you want to crack down on corruption, which Karzai didn't, you can't, because the people who stole the election for you or you're beholden to them. And beyond that, of course, if you steal an election, that's what enables you to steal everything else. And it didn't. And so, of course, as I said, these were UN-sponsored, UN-paid-for elections. And the mandate from the Security Council was to support Afghan institutions, namely the Independent Election Commission, in the conduct of free, fair, transparent, and inclusive elections. Well, that was impossible to do since they were the people stealing the election. And
right. But the ones who fired you had to know. They had to know.
They did know. 1,500 ghost polling centers that produced hundreds of thousands of bogus ballots.
And of course, they tried to slime you on the way out the door too, as I recall. So
that too. But in the end, and I of course I fault Coyote, who had been my friend, who was the head of the mission. But I really fault Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General. Yeah, this was the biggest undertaking of the United Nations. And Ban went along with a fraud that was basically did great damage to the UN's reputation and that undermined the efforts in Afghanistan. And here I fault, although I'm a great admirer of President Obama, I fault him here too. Rather than confronting the issue, everybody just glossed over it, accepted that Karzai was somehow the legitimate president, elected president of Afghanistan. Then the same thing happened in 2014. Abdullah, the same guy who was robbed in 2009, was clearly robbed in 2014. Instead of insisting on fair elections, we brokered a compromise where Ashraf Ghani, who was one of the victims of the 2009 fraud, became the president and Abdullah the chief executive. And then again, it happened in 2019. And we just glided over it because it was too hard to do something about it.
Right, which is what makes Joe Biden one of the most politically courageous presidents I've ever seen, to have done what he did, to pull us out of there.
I'm amazing. With you. And the notion that he's at fault for this is so wrong, so insulting. First, it wasn't possible. Richard Haas, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, who was involved in the early years in Afghanistan, he makes the point, we could have just left 2,500 troops there. No, we couldn't. The only reason we had 2,500 is that we had a deal with the Taliban, basically a surrender deal. While we're withdrawing, don't attack us. And they didn't. But if we had broken the deal, we would have had, as Biden said, we would have had to send many more troops in. And then the notion that we somehow should have done the evacuation sooner. Well, if we started pulling everybody out, including key Afghan government people who were at risk, everybody said we precipitated the collapse. And all of this obscures the extent of the failure. And I'll just tell you a personal story about that. I made, as you mentioned, my first trip into Afghanistan on February 14th, 1989. My friend, lifelong friend, had become Prime Minister of Pakistan. And so I asked if she could arrange it with the Pakistani ISI. Inter-Services Intelligence. So they took me in. And it was February 14th, we went to the outskirts of Jalalabad. That day was the day that the Soviet Union, a day early, completed its withdrawal. The last person to cross across the Oxus River into the Soviet Union was the Major General Gromov. He was in the last APC crossing the bridge. The Soviet-installed government of Najibullah lasted another 3 years. It lasted longer than the Soviet Union itself. 3 years. It lasted longer than the Soviet Union. Wow. The Soviet puppet regime. and the Soviet Union, I would guess, spent about $70 billion on their 10-year Afghan war. The Americans, again, 20 years, $2 trillion. No, wait a minute. The Afghan government didn't even last to the end of the American withdrawal. The last American to leave was, guess what? Another major general. And there you have that image of the guy through the night view getting on the last plane out, the major general. But that was 2 weeks after the Taliban had taken over Kabul.
Unbelievable.
I mean, there cannot be a greater case of failure. And so to blame Joe Biden in any way for having somehow caused when it was the fault of a failed strategy pursued for 20 years.
What is the name of the woman who the Minister of Education, the woman who's is she the Minister of Education? She stayed.
Peroxide, but I'm not sure that that's who you mean.
They claim that they're not going to do anything, but I don't believe a word they say. I really don't.
There have been killings, particularly in the Panjshir Valley, which was the last province to hold out. The villagers had credible reports of villagers being massacred, and a couple of the Panjshir leaders, one of the generals there, this is the resistance, and their spokesman were captured, and then their bodies showed torture and of course having been executed.
There's this. I feel like a terrible person. I was sitting here wondering when we pulled out. I was going through all of the. What should we have done? What could we have done to save? For me, it's the women. And frankly, if I were a woman in Afghanistan, if I couldn't leave, I would fight. That's all there is to it.
Well, and many
you have to fight for yourself.
Well, I think it's important to understand about the women in Afghanistan is that 2/3 of the women in Afghanistan, like 2/3 of the population, live in rural areas.
Right.
And all these things that we claimed we were doing didn't happen in those rural areas. I mean, in most places, girls did not go to school, at least in most of the Pashtun areas. Yes, we built schools, but we didn't supervise them. So the shoddy contractors ripping things off. Hired teachers, but the teachers didn't show up, or the parents had to pay bribes. And so, at least in the Pashtun parts of the country, which is about 45% of the population, very little, there's very little progress for girls or women. And beyond that, then they experienced war, night raids. You had extended families, family members being killed. So for a significant number of Afghan women, this wonderful period that we talk about so much wasn't wonderful at all.
Didn't really happen for most of them.
Afghanistan became more urbanized over the last 20 years, and for urban women there were more opportunities. But the people who really benefited were a very small elite at the top. It's important, but to understand the failure and to understand why women aren't fighting more than they are is to understand that all the promise that we made and that we pat ourselves on the back for having achieved was not all that widespread. I want to say something else about this, because there's talk about women, but there isn't so much talk about the ethnic communities. First, begin with the Hazaras, who are Shiite. They're in the Central Highlands. Bamyan is the center of the Hazara region. That's where the Buddhists were that the Taliban blew up in, I think, 2001. The Taliban considers Shiites to be apostates. And if you're an apostate, the only solution is to kill you. And in the 1990s, there was the beginnings of a genocide. There were certainly massacres. So I should say possible beginnings of a genocide. So this community, is basically terrified, 15% of Afghanistan's population. And then the Tajiks, who are 25%, again, they were our allies, the Northern Alliance in 2001. They are concerned about that. They never shared the sort of Taliban ideology. There were very few Taliban among the Tajiks. And they're worried about being repressed and excluded. The new government was announced in Afghanistan. It included no women, but it also included no Hazaras, one Tajik and one Uzbek. And most of the statements put out by the government, or maybe all of them, have been in Pashto, which is not the national language. The national language is Dari, which is the Eastern dialect of Persian. That's the language that's sort of used. It has been used officially. So it's there. These documents are totally, everything that's done is inaccessible to about half of Afghanistan's population.
If I were you, I'd be feeling pretty vindicated right now about a lot of stuff.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, but and to be honest, I do, but there's very limited satisfaction to just saying,
right,
I told you so, when there's so much tragedy but to be honest, I really do want to see accountability. I mean, the notion that this is going to slide off and on discussions of a sloppy withdrawal, or whether we should have kept a few thousand troops there, which was impossible, and not hold accountable the military commanders who sold a strategy that they knew wouldn't work, not to hold accountable the foreign policy elite that sold the idea of making Afghanistan into a centralized state, this elaborate nation building. I don't hold most of the problems there. I don't put them on on the presidents, not on President Bush, not on President Obama, not on the former guy, and of course I think Biden did the right thing. It was the arrogance of the foreign policy community and establishment, of which I guess I was a part, although not really sharing all their having my own views, but and that was my career. They're my compatriots, and of the military guys, the commanders, who pursued a strategy, who tried to fit the facts to a strategy rather than having a strategy would work. And when you get it wrong, the costs, and just in human lives, is just huge. And finally, I just want to say, when Biden gave that speech, I think on September 1st, there was something so significant in that speech. He says, we're not going to be sending our military on large-scale missions. We'll fight to defend ourselves if there's some specific threats. I mean, that is a big repudiation of what we've done over the last 20 years. And my hope is that we'll end up being a more normal country rather than feeling that having the arrogance to think that we can reshape the world. In some sense, it's certainly a repudiation of the neoconservatives of the Bush era. It's also, I think, a repudiation of some of the Clinton era, of Madeleine Albright, and the notion of the United States as the indispensable nation. Well, we aren't. We're important. We have, many cases, very good values, but we aren't the indispensable nation. And when we arrogantly believed we were, it produced two disasters.
It's so odd. My son was born in 1999, and when he was born, I named him after my father, who was killed in Vietnam. And I really thought that he was born into a world where that wasn't going to happen anymore. There weren't going to be any more Vietnam orphans killed in worthless, pointless, purposeless wars. And then 2 years later, an entire new generation of orphans of a pointless, purposeless American incursion into what? A black hole of death for no reason. It makes me crazy. It makes me crazy that it happened all over again. And people like you were not listened to. And the people that encouraged it are now getting jobs advising people to do it again.
Well, and the worst part of it is there's no penalty to being wrong. There is a penalty to being right. And this goes back a long time. In the Second World War, there were different security risk categories: people who had been, communists, people who had been, pro-German, homosexuals. But there was one category called PAF, and that stood for premature anti-fascist. for being against the Nazis a little too soon. This was an FBI security risk. And you go back, think of the 1980s. Imagine an analyst in the intelligence community who wrote a paper saying, we don't need to be spending hundreds of billions of dollars to counter the Soviet Union because it's not going to be around in 4 years. That person would have been thought of as, would have been ostracized, maybe not fired, but, perhaps transferred to the Burkina Faso file. But all those people who got it wrong talked about the Soviet threat and the danger, and who said Gorbachev was a fraud and a KG. They just went on to continue to have successful careers. I mean, this is at the nub of the problem, and that is why I do believe it's important to have accountability rather than allowing the people who got this wrong to just glide over their error.
Thanks for listening to this unique installment of Open World Chat, and thanks very much to Maryscott O'Connor for filling in for Leanne Allen, who will be back next time. And a special thanks again to our guest Peter Galbraith for taking us in a direction Open World Chat doesn't usually go, but it was a very important conversation to have. We hope you enjoyed it. Our theme music is by Christopher Piatek.